I'm responding to Leland's claim that Common Core has a negative effect on the education of students. He claims that students are less prepared for standardized tests because of Common Core, citing lower test scores, that standardization of tests still varies among states, and that states are beginning to leave Common Core because of negative effects. Starting with scores, according to Lauren Cameron in the article, High School Seniors Aren't College Ready, there's been a small drop in proficient scores while there's a larger increase in below basic scores. In her article, she cites Peggy Carr, who is the commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, and she states that she believes that the rise of scores among the best students could be the result of more students taking advanced courses, whereas these lower scores could be the result of a historic low dropout rate, whereas historically in the past, these students would have already dropped out. But now they're staying and taking the test. He also claimed that test scores have always been lower since 2009, which this cannot be the result of Common Core, as Common Core was first adopted by Kentucky in 2010 and implemented the next year. In an article by Valerie Strauss, What the Drop in NAEP Math Scores Tells Us About Common Core and NAEP, Sarah Lubinsky, a math education professor who's had previous studies about the National Assessment for Educational Progress, describes the data she found in the NAEP Data Explorer showing the general increase in math scores since 1990, and describing that there was actually a small drop not since 2009, but in 2013, 2015. Now, looking at these math scores, she points out that a large drop came from data and probability scores, and she explains that these are between 4th and 8th graders, and Common Core suggests that probability be delayed until 6th grade, which she then states begs the question of why it's being tested in 4th grade. Now, as for the 8th graders, this could be a result of transitioning to the new standards, as most states actually implemented Common Core in 2013, 2014. The advocate also gives an example of his brother providing him with a test and saying that he is ready for college, in contrast to a test from Common Core. Unfortunately, he doesn't provide any qualifications for his brother, so we cannot assume that his brother is a source of authority in math or college readiness in math. Moving on to the variation in scores. The advocate explains that among different states on the same test, similar scores would get either approached expectations or proficient, depending on the state. And in the article he cites, by Makoto-Rich, test scores under Common Core show proficient varies by state. Makoto-Rich actually acknowledges that, first off, the variation was worse before Common Core, but he also explains that the PARCC tests divided scores into 5 categories and dictated that the third be approached expectations. Rich also cites James Wright, who is the director of Ohio Office of Curriculum and Assessment, who states that this discrepancy comes because in Ohio there is a law that dictates the third level be proficient instead. But he also states that it was made very clear throughout the process that they were discussing the third level of scores, this third bracket, and that parents could easily check online to see how their students had scored in Ohio based on the PARCC standards. Furthermore, the advocate claims that only 20 of the original 45 states are still in Common Core, and he derives this from Michael McGrady's article, 62% of states have dropped out of Common Core consortia. In that article, he states that this is in reference to the number of states using Common Core aligned assessments, and immediately after he notes that this isn't reflective of the number of states officially revoking Common Core, which was 3 at the time of publishing. Finally, Common Core is actually shown to be effective if used with the right tools. An article by Robert Rothman has the first state to adopt Common Core develop tools that make the controversial standards work. Teachers reported success with Common Core when implementing Literacy Design Collaborative and Mathematics Design Collaborative, which are flexible templates that allow teachers to adapt material to adapt to these new standards. Rothman cites a survey done by Research for Action, polling teachers using these tools, and they described that 82% increased their writing expectations, 77% said it helped them engage students with different learning abilities, and that 80% actually received higher quality writing from their students. Overall, lower test scores cannot be attributed to Common Core. Variation of scores is corrected with tests online results. Most states are actually still in Common Core, and Common Core has shown to be effective if used with proper tools. Thank you.
All right, well, the material is labeled well at the beginning of the speech. The signpost on the first point is relatively clear. You cite the evidence frequently, but you do need to sometimes give us the claim. You occasionally are letting the evidence make the argument for you. That was especially true at the beginning of the speech. I thought you did a little bit better job later on in the presentation, telling us what inference you were about to make and then giving us the evidence. In the first section, though, it was all evidence, 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 and then we have to figure out kind of what claim is being made there in the evidence. And so you always want to have a more clear declarative statement. There's an analysis of the scores that I think is a bit confusing, and I'm not exactly sure how it advances your point on that first point. That's a little bit problematic. The better argument seemed to be that the changes in scores started in 2009, that they were declining, and the Common Core didn't come in until 2010. I think that undermines the reasoning that the advocate was using there, and that's a pretty good argument. And then there was some good information on the math scores, but it does sound a little bit confusing on the standards, what the different standards are. There's this long discussion about what the hell's going on in some of the states and what proficiency is and that kind of thing, and that got a little bit confusing. And as I said at one point, on the second point, when you were talking about this, there's this whole discussion about this issue, and it's one of those inside baseball sorts of things where you gotta be understanding what the hell is going on inside for it to make much sense, and I think a lot of us are gonna be outsiders on that, and it needs... it might be a good argument in the context of people who are fighting about the issue of Common Core, but you have to remember that you're talking to people who aren't necessarily involved in that debate, so you've got to make it clearer and simpler there. Like I said, the issue of proficiency, well, we've got two categories of approaching proficiency and proficiency, and that's what the difference is. Okay, basically it means that the only reason that they don't reach proficient is because they created an additional category to try and cover that and give us more detailed information. It doesn't mean that the test scores were bad. That's what your argument is. So you need to say it that way. I thought you had a good explanation about the states withdrawing and that they weren't really withdrawing officially, and that they've just withdrawn from the one consortium that deals with the test assessment that's being used, not necessarily from Common Core itself. That was reasonable. And then the argument about the tools, we're getting close to being inside baseball again here. There's some statistical information that talks about how supposedly it improved writing performance and the teachers were happy with it and they got better results. That's not bad information. I think it's pretty helpful there. I thought you had an excellent summary of what your argument was at the end, and you do a very good job for the most part talking to the audience and trying to convince us of your position and gaining some ethos and credibility by addressing the audience more directly instead of just reading from the notes that you've got. All right, thank you.